This time I'm speaking to you not to introduce anybody else, but to introduce myself. By way of doing that, let me just explain a little bit about the background to this paper and why I am working on some of these issues and why the Carr Center is doing this now. So I have, some of you may know, I've in the last 15 years or so, I've been mostly working on a neighboring topic, not so much human rights and AI, or not human rights actually really at all, but justice. So neighboring topics. So this has been my main theme. And in fact, as of now, I have two new books forthcoming in this domain. So one is called On Trade Justice, philosophical plea for a global New Deal, with a co-author named Gabriel Wollner that's coming out with Oxford next year. And I have this other longer study called this is just called On Justice, Theory, Philosophy, and I guess I'll put something else. So I like writing books that have on and justice in the name. So there's a longer conceptual study about how there's actually common themes around how talk about justice, about what has been meant by justice, and there's a certain development over history, but there's identifiable themes really also across culture. So there's a common human concern behind specifically also distributive justice that one can trace. And anyway, it's a longer story. So this is what I finished up with. And so there was at this stage no urgent need to develop a new research project, since especially the second book also takes some more work, and before it's finally out, this is going to be a couple of years. But then something else happened, namely I was somewhat unexpectedly asked to be the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And then the question was, what's the cool new thing that we could do with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy? And then I thought, wow, so there's all these fascinating questions about technology in the air, and there's so many fascinating people around the university who work on this. And so this is just an amazing topic for the Carr Center, and really also as a Carr Center, as a center research project, it's so suitable because we can engage it at these different levels. Right? There's all sorts of issues going on right now. So the kind of thing that also Barbara Gross was talking about yesterday, about design of systems and how is technology engaging specifically human rights. Vivek Krishnamurthy and his team published a wonderful report for the Canadian government, basically spelling this out right by right. So how is AI affecting the various items on the Universal Declaration? Then you can think about the medium term. What kind of society is going to come out of this once technological innovation is fully hit? What kind of society do we want, and what do we do now to make sure we get that society? And then we have the big picture questions that also appeared in Susan's talk just now, and Max Tegmark's talk yesterday about how do we think about consciousness of machines? How do we conceptualize the possibility that we may have to share political and social spaces with machines at some point in the long run, in some sense. So that's what makes this exciting as a research outlook for a center that people can engage at these different levels, which also is then an invitation for people from different disciplines, ranging from philosophers, social scientists, legal scholars, and physicists, futuristic minds, just the whole range of. So that's the background to this. So I've started to write up a number of things, also then bridging the concerns of trying to bridge the concerns also that are happening in the human rights community with some more philosophical ideas. I have one paper forthcoming in Human Rights Quarterly, which is actually a journal read by people in the human rights community, which is called Human Rights and AI, an Urgently Needed Agenda, spelling out a little bit the themes that are coming up. And so this project here is a continuation of that. So the title is slightly different from what's in the program, Human Rights and AI and Heideggerian Techno-Skepticism. I was a little bit shy putting this in there, since I figured nobody would come on a Saturday morning if they know it's about Heideggerian Techno-Skepticism. So, but it is partly, so now that you are seated, so I can Anyway, so I'm going to do this somewhat the old-fashioned way. I'm going to read to you a paper, but there's going to be background entertainment coming along also. So without further ado, so by way of diagnosing the current cultural and scientific state of affairs, Friedrich Nietzsche famously spoke of the death of God. The key to that ominous phrase is that anything that can die must once have lived. God is said to have, it's not a Game of Thrones throne line, by the way, even though it sounds like that. God is said to have lived at some point, but then perished. Belief in a God who represented a metaphysical reality beyond human perception was warranted for some period, but no longer is. What, according to Nietzsche, brought about that change is our inquisitiveness about what the world is really like, triggered by the very stipulation of such a God. Ultimately, that God himself became incredible. Inquiry in particular erodes sources of moral certainty, making us scramble to identify new ones. Philosophers have endeavored to do just that. There's a wealth of proposals to make sense of our moral lives that do not depend on theology. But the current intellectual climate in philosophy certainly is such that the burden is distinctly on those who actually wish to theorize notions such as justice or also human rights. So I'm somewhat reluctant saying that as the director of a Center for Human Rights Policy, since of course we are also, we are standing there, right, in this domain. But as a philosopher, we know there's a burden of proof, right? Intellectually, there's a burden of proof, and that really is the theme of the death of God coming out of Nietzsche. So philosophers, must persuade those who believe the death of God metaphor reaches much beyond theology and altogether undermines our ability to make moral demands against each other. A broadened understanding of the death of God claim is useful to characterize our intellectual situation when it comes to the long-term challenges around AI. On the one hand, scientific inquiry has brought AI on our radar. On the other hand, it is precisely because we have made so much progress that we also increasingly grasp the limits of our understanding elsewhere. Lack of agreement on moral foundations is a case in point. Another is our comprehension of something very basic, namely consciousness. Is the mind just the brain, or is there more to it? If so, what? If the mind just is the brain, does this mean the mind is an entirely physiological phenomenon? On any of these possibilities, could machines have minds? Much as moral philosophy continues its disagreements about foundations of morality, so philosophy of mind is divided about our mental self-understanding. The broader understanding of the death of God challenge is, in a nutshell then, that knowledge enables but also throws into doubt. While we increasingly know how to build smart machines, we do not know what kind of morality to code into them, nor what kind they will gravitate towards once their own learning kicks in, nor can we be sure if machines can end up having minds. Barely does a day go by without reporting on this or that innovation classified as AI. Such reporting normally concerns special AI, smart machines with some capacity to learn on their own. For the taste of many engineers, there's too much hype about general AI, which approximates or surpasses natural intelligence across a broad range of contexts. They remind us that we, or that is they, the engineers, are nowhere near developing something like that. But nowhere near means in terms of current technology. Innovation may quickly revolutionize how things are done, and innovation revolutionizes things ever more quickly. I think about things like smartphones, right? How quickly they caught on, and certainly accelerating pace there. How much time will pass before major breakthroughs occur is a question that has no good answer. We must reflect on the impact of technology, even though we have no clear idea when it will arrive, if ever. My concern is with the impact of AI on human rights. We can use a time axis to differentiate among various ways for technology to have an impact on life generally and human rights specifically, short, medium, and long term, something already just sketched briefly. The short term is what already goes on and is subject to scientific investigation and legal analysis. This short term is not my topic, so Vivek's report is wonderful to read on what's going on right now. The medium term is the period when new technologies will have transformed society, but machines themselves do not yet come up for moral consideration. What such a period will look like is hard to envisage, since much technological innovation generating yet more innovation will occur by then. Plausibly, the nature of work will change. Algorithms embedded into appropriately designed devices with access to enormous amounts of data will eliminate or radically alter many jobs where they currently merely assist humans. In medicine, there will be much progress in prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. Gene editing, a big topic this week, right? Gene editing is very much on the horizon. way more now than when I actually wrote that sentence a couple of weeks ago. And in this medium term, parental selection, prenatal selection may noticeably affect the composition of the population. Imagine what wealthy people will do once this becomes easily accessible, right? Over generation, the wealthy may well on average be distinctly more attractive by all normal standards than the poor. Warfare too may change through drones and automated weapon systems, and of course strategic changes in the distribution of global power may occur. Think about all the activity in China around these things right now. This is a period beyond the ken of present social scientific research. Historical learning is also only of limited value here. So far, technological innovation has on balance always created more jobs than it has annihilated, as the optimists remind us. Maybe this will be so again. Innovation creates new challenges and generates needs for new products and activities. In benign scenarios, new technologies would allow people a kind of leisure time that historically only a select few could enjoy. But technology might also create a situation where many are no longer needed at all, and where the wealthy refuse to share what they can accumulate without cooperation of others. Instead, they withdraw to gated communities where food production, transportation, and upkeep is relegated to machines. Quite possibly, and this is a major difference to earlier technological revolutions, many people will be dispensable economically, and once no longer needed for production or consumption, their claims to political consideration of society might fade away. The long term is when machines have become so sophisticated that the question arises of whether they come up for moral consideration on their own terms. Now, the difference between medium and long term might be more analytical than chronological, but it is sensible to investigate the defining themes in both terms separately. One possibility is that there will be cyborgs, organic beings with integrated artificial parts, or perhaps increasingly sophisticated machines will be ever more human-like, creating an android population alongside genetically enhanced humans. So that's what Max Tegmark also has in mind when he talks about Life 3.0, right? This 3.0 situation like that. Perhaps digitalized brains could be uploaded and thus preserved. There's debate about whether this is actually doable, but it's something on the radar. Or there could be sophisticated machines that are simply nothing like humans. Such engineered entities might eventually surpass humans in just about all mental and many other capacities, and will then also be able to design other entities, yet other entities that surpass them. This moment is known as the singularity, and you saw this video yesterday where Max Tegmark presented to you a lot of distinguished experts who said that the singularity is coming our way. Only Elon Musk said it wasn't, right? So that was quite striking. Such a moment would have a dramatic impact, but much earlier we might end up with machines that must be taken seriously as co-inhabitants of the same social spaces as humans. Once the main difference is that we are made from carbon and they are not, they deserve serious moral consideration. Max Tegmark likes to talk about carbon chauvinism here, right? We shouldn't be carbon chauvinists. So Peter Singer talked about speciesism. Now we're talking about carbon chauvinism, right? So that's the progression of things here. These matters are both moral and political in nature. Humans have kept other animals under control by domesticating them to enjoy their company or harvest their bodies, using them as zoo displays or corralling them into wildlife preserves. But smart machines might rebel against their creators. So this is where we're getting to Heidegger now. So by way of preparing our investigation of the medium and long term, and medium and long term are my topic here, I now identify two presumptions we should only make with qualifications. These presumptions are that A, for the time being, investigating the impact of artificial intelligence, especially in the human rights domain, is a matter of investigating the impact of certain tools, and that B, the crucial issue is that some of these tools, the artificially intelligent ones, in the long run might become too much like their creators. We turn to Martin Heidegger's philosophy of technology to argue that these presumptions require substantial qualification. So Heidegger's philosophy of technology is in this whole domain of philosophy of technology, this is still very much a cornerstone, right? So for many people, Heidegger is a bit of an obscure figure and a difficult figure to deal with. But in the philosophy of technology, there is one particular essay that he wrote that is still quite stage-setting. Though broadly recognized as one of the 20th century's most significant philosophers, Heidegger is off-putting for two reasons. For one thing, his writing are forbidding, littered with technical jargon taken from everyday German, but then used terminologically and hard to translate. But Heidegger seeks to reflect on just what it is for us to be in the world, and this task is not what our vocabulary is normally used for. So one needs to be a bit patient there, quite a bit patient actually. The other reason is this, and the other reason why he is off-putting is his involvement with the Nazis. But though these are very real concerns, they must not deceive us about Heidegger's path-breaking importance, especially for a proper understanding of human life in the technological era. This point is reinforced by the fact that Heidegger's premier American propagator, Cuba Dreyfus, a Berkeley philosopher who just passed away in 2017, was an early and influential critic of AI. Dreyfus articulated his criticisms from a distinctly Heideggerian standpoint in ways that over time increasingly many people have seen as valid. There's actually quite an interesting story. Bert Dreyfus was an assistant professor at MIT just at the time when there was a lot of enthusiasm about how we would be how we would be able to engineer minds, right? And he basically said, no, this can't be done. And he was articulating that from a distinctly Heideggerian standpoint, and this is how this whole position actually entered into this debate. And as also it became increasingly clear that there's a lot of complexities involved in designing, any kind of designing any kind of intelligence. This standpoint also caught on quite a bit more in the neuroscience community. Heidegger resists much traditional philosophy by focusing on the concrete living experiences of human beings in their respectively thick contexts. An informative contrast is with Descartes, who understood human beings essentially in terms of thinking abilities. But what is distinctive about the human manner of being in the world, according to Heidegger, is not that we reflect, but that we care about things whose meaning is established through use patterns in a shared life world. Heidegger seeks to capture our inherently social existence as beings who always already possess a pre-theoretical grasp of the structures that make possible particular ways of being in the world. The possibilities we understand are those whose meanings we share with everyone else around us. For example, a hammer's being in our human life world is its readiness to hand, its role in our world. Its weight is understood in terms of its place in our world is its being too light or too heavy to use effectively, not a neutral 1 or 2 pounds. Its location in that same sense is the fact that it is too near or too far to use well, not a point on a geometric grid. Much like our ways of integrating hammers into our life worlds, more generally, our use patterns, movements, choices, and thoughts are thus usually merely instances of what we or they do or choose or believe. Thinking itself is always thinking about things originally discovered in everyday practical engagements. Our understanding of the world is not reducible to a brain state, but constituted by a whole body integrated into a world of objects and relations interconnected in complex ways. This view inspired criticism of scientific approaches that did reduce our being in the world to brain states. French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty objected to mainstream psychology, insisting that body skills are constitutive of and not merely directed by intelligence. Right? So we are in the world with the whole body, not just with the brain. Based on Heidegger's general outlook on Merleau-Ponty's elaboration, Cuba Dreyfus has argued that disembodied symbol manipulation cannot realistically hope to reproduce the flexible and nuanced, competent behavior humans display routinely. So in a way, much of what Barbara was demonstrating yesterday about the difficulties of designing machines, from a Heideggerian standpoint, they would say this is a vindication about the complexities of human life. You know? As a result, for machines to become smarter will not mean they ipso facto become increasingly human-like. It takes much more than intelligence to do so. Another theme in Heidegger is how the ways in which we are embedded into our social world must also be understood as opening up certain possibilities while closing off others. It is because of certain background understandings that we know what is under discussion. Heidegger calls such background understandings horizons of disclosure. In the present age, it is the ways in which technology is integrated into our lives that determines our horizons of disclosure. Heidegger takes on the ordinary understanding of technology as means to ends and as products of human activity. Technology, on that view, is a set of tools we control, a vast array of instruments, artifacts, and devices. This understanding, however, does not do justice to technology's significance in human life. Technology makes things show up as mattering in some way or another. That is, technology is a mode of revealing, as Heidegger says, a mode of revealing, one that understands phenomena in general to be merely what he calls a standing reserve. So in resources to be exploited as means. Heidegger uses the example of a hydroelectric plant on the river Rhine that converts the river into a mere supplier of water power. By way of contrast, an old wooden bridge that spanned the river for hundreds of years reveals it as a natural environment and permits a kind of poetic habitation where natural phenomena are revealed as objects of respect and wonder. Right? So technology brings things into our lives in certain ways, that it makes them show up in certain ways. It makes us look at the world in certain ways, and there's other ways of looking at the world. Right? That's the and the current way in which things show up is the standing reserve. Right? They're always there. Things are always there. Including, if you think of something like human trafficking, including human bodies, right? They're there as a kind of standing reserve to be used. Technological revealing extinguishes any sense of awe and wonder, a loss to which we are essentially indifferent. In one striking formulation, Heidegger pointed out that the modern world reveals itself as a gigantic petrol station. Trees become sources of cellulose, rivers suppliers of powers, unspoiled areas are reduced to resources ripe for exploitation by tourism, and people become sexual resources. Technology has the potential to turn us into people who can relate to the world only in impoverished ways. Everything is exchangeable. Efficiency and optimization set the stage, demanding standardization and repetition. Technology saves us from developing skills, transforming us into people satisfied that way. For Heidegger's ideas to be illuminating and helpful philosophical thought, rather than retrograde agrarian nostalgia, which is what they are often accused of being, right? Retrograde agrarian nostalgia, we must not read it as Luddite rejection of technology. Instead, technology needs to be there for us to enjoy and use, but is not our only or fundamental way of encountering entities. One way or another, we need a receptivity to and desire to care about things as they are independently of us. So, with these insights in mind, so enough Heidegger. With these insights in mind, let us return to the medium term. The worry about that period is this. Many philosophers and activists prefer to treat rights separately from distributive justice. Both pragmatically and philosophically speaking, rights, especially human rights, seem beyond contestation in ways distributive justice never could be. But such an approach fails to make rights, especially human rights, a comprehensive or even stable ideal worth pursuing. The reason is that if technological advancement does render large parts of the population redundant, considerations of social and global distributive justice might lose their grip altogether, and alongside them, human rights might as well. For vividness, consider the 2013 science fiction movie Elysium. Set in 2154, who has seen this movie, Elysium? Here, some of you have. It's not a terribly good movie, but it demonstrates my point here. Set in 2154, Earth is overpopulated and polluted. Most people live on the edge of starvation with little technology or medical attention. The wealthy live on a gigantic space habitat in Earth's orbit called Elysium, so the Greek term for heaven. Right? So Elysium is technologically advanced with devices to cure diseases and reverse aging. There's much hostility, as you can imagine, between Earth and Elysium. The way to avoid such scenarios is to strengthen social and global distributive justice now, to nip in the bud any kind of development that would lead to scenarios where neither distributive justice nor human rights would have much of a grip. An early statement of how rights constitute an insufficient ideal for emancipation appears in Marx's 1843 treatise on the Jewish question. So this is from his city of birth in Trier, right? Marx, as you may know, turned 200. this year, and so there's lots of funky stuff going on in Trier. On the Jewish question, ostensibly Marx is assessing attempts by Jews to achieve emancipation in Prussia. Marx questions the potential of rights to create genuinely human emancipation. Rights keep people isolated from each other, protecting them only in their pursuit of private interest, especially property. Therefore, humans qua species beings, as Marx puts it, are neglected. For Marx, our species being is about a communally richer experience than a society focused on political emancipation in terms of rights makes possible. Marx's point dovetails with, but is also different from Heidegger's concern about our social world overall being able to reveal only a limited range of possibilities that there are in the world. Both warn us that ideals we cherish, human rights in one case and technology in the other, harbor potential for generating impoverished lives if we are not watching carefully. Marx's concern that a rights-based political theory captures an impoverished ideal has found many echoes also in the work of one of the most important figures of recent political thought, John Rawls. Like Marx, Rawls insists on a richer ideal of communal life beyond what rights can establish, but unlike Marx, he did so explicitly in terms of social justice rather than in terms of human species being. Now, this much has been about the domestic level. More recently, as far as the international level is concerned, historian Samuel Moyn has questioned the emancipatory attractiveness specifically of human rights. Moyn argues that the human rights movement succeeded while other options were also on the table, including a UN framework more concerned with integration and empowerment of developing countries. So it's a standing concern about the human rights movement that in a neoliberal world, basically the powerful settled for allowed the human rights movement to flourish while consistently defeating other more ambitious institutional proposals, and that of course happened in the international domain, especially between the late 40s and the late 70s. Right? So the more ambitious institutional proposals are now so much history that nobody quite remembers this, even this all kind of went away in the late 70s. Human rights activists sought remedies for destitution without challenging wealth, so without trying to achieve a more equitable and to that extent more humane world. My own approach to global justice is broadly supportive of Moyn's critique on global justice, not to say terribly much about this on global justice, embeds human rights into a larger structure of global distributive justice. And my forthcoming book on trade justice, A Philosophical Plea for a New Global Deal, elaborates on these themes within the domain of trade. To see how all this matters for our current discussion, recall Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty's point is that the inner workings of capitalism are such that in times of peace, those who own the means of production benefit proportionately more from the economy than those who merely work there. Across generations, the result is an enormous increase in wealth inequality, not due to wage differentials, but due to inherited wealth. In the 20th century, the Great Depression and two global wars created so much calamity that these tendencies remained hidden. More recently, historian Walter Scheidel has added his analysis that historically speaking, serious efforts to reduce inequality only ever succeeded in times of disaster, such as economic collapse or pandemics. Only then could political momentum bring about lasting economic change. Putting these perspectives together is actually quite depressing. So putting these perspectives together, there will either be more and more inequality or not. But if not, it will be because of some such calamity. Either way, this would not be a world many of us would happily inhabit. In the Marxian picture, increasing inequality, or that is indigence on the lower end of the economic ladder, eventually triggers a revolution. However, there could be a revolution only if the working class remained within the capitalist economy and was needed there. There could be no revolution if people left in response to grievances or were pushed out of society. But it is precisely that kind of possibility, the pushing out, that technological innovation dangles before us, with Elysium being an eerily extreme vision of a future that is post-revolutionary in a very different sense than what Marx had in mind. Post-Marxist thinkers had to explain why the revolution Marx predicted never happened, at least not that kind that he had in mind. Their explanation was that capitalism succeeded in co-opting the working class. It offered them just enough and the right kind of thing for the purpose for any revolutionary energies they ever might have had to evaporate. In the process, capitalism also obtained a vast sea of customers for products they had no deeper need to buy. What otherwise might be revolutionary impetus is transformed into consumer satisfaction. However, it might all be a rather different story in the medium term. Many tasks performed by low-income workers can be outsourced to machines. Economic structures might change in such a way that it is ownership of data that constitutes wealth. The source of wealth no longer is that people buy stuff. In that case, the underclass might no longer be needed to keep the economy going. They might live in Bantustans, as in South Africa, people of color in South Africa did, and eventually there might be something like an Elysium. The wealthy transpire into the sky, the underprivileged fade from view, and would be out of mind as well, undermining any psychological or political capacity to accommodate them. The point is not just psychological and political. Social justice is fueled by claims people make because they are cooperators in a vast and intricate system and comply with rules. If they do all that, they have a good reason to demand shares in the political economy. But if they are no longer economically integrated, they no longer have any political or philosophical grounds to clamor for social justice. Social justice is a term that only became applicable under conditions of dense interconnectedness the Industrial Revolution made possible. But eventually, advancing industrialization itself might undermine that very interconnectedness based on which social justice claims made sense. But societal fragmentation must also be seen at the global level. The fearsome scenario for the future we just explored would also entail that a number of reasons that allow us to argue for human rights would disappear. If there's no interconnectedness within societies, there's no interconnectedness globally. That in turn would undermine argumentative support for human rights from global interconnectedness. There would still be claims that draw on common humanity alone, but those would likely be motivationally impotent absent global interconnectedness, much as Cicero's talk about natural law had no effect on Roman willingness to give any moral consideration to Germanic tribes, let alone to people in parts of the world the Romans only knew from hearsay. A potential remedy, and that's the upshot of all this, a potential remedy is to emphasize social and global distributive justice now, whose realization would strengthen the social interconnectedness that renders social justice and global distributive justice applicable. Distributive justice should be promoted by anybody concerned with human rights. So this is in a way a plea to the human rights community not to say, human rights have this kind of pristine nature and we should just stick with them. If you do that, that kind of sets you up for irrelevance in the long term. Right? So focusing on human rights exclusively is neither philosophically plausible nor strategically advisable as far as this medium term is concerned. That is, unless we get more serious about distributive justice now, we will lose any serious prospects of having human rights realized in the long run, and alongside, we also lose any plausible possibility to have human rights realized. So much about the medium run, human rights and AI in the long term now. So the hallmark of the long term is that machines themselves may well come up for moral consideration. My point here is that it is indeed plausible that machines will be moral agents of sorts in the future, and that this will require radical rethinking of our societies in ways that includes machines as participants of sorts. We will best prepare for that if we start taking social justice considerations more seriously at this stage. If humans are taken seriously now, or for that matter, humans and animals, right, so the kind of creatures we have around now, machines can be more smoothly integrated into society when the time comes. So these various visions that Max Tegmark had yesterday about how we might live together, right? If we set a good example of that, then maybe we'll be tolerated in more pleasant ways in the future. So let me illustrate what is at issue with another movie, and this is going to be a serious spoiler alert since I can't make my point about this one without telling you the whole. It's also not a good movie, so this is the only exposure to that movie that you'll ever need. So the 2018 Netflix production Extinction, set at an unknown time in the future, we witness what appears to be a brutal alien invasion to extinguish humanity. Anybody seen this movie? So it looks like there's these aliens. So this guy on the left looks like an alien, right? And so the guys on the right, they look like they're human, right? So this is what we see. only gradually do viewers understand that the invaders are humans who come to reclaim the planet from androids who had driven them into interplanetary exile 50 years earlier and had self-implanted memories to create experiences of living in a human society. That earlier conflict occurred because androids had become human-like but were treated as tools. Tools, however, that could increasingly feel humiliation. We see flashbacks at demonstrations where human mobs chant, "You will not replace us." That's actually one good scene in the movie, right? Where they're really bringing in this, this bad stuff that happened in the South, right? This chanting, "You will not replace us," but it's meant to be humans clamoring against these robots. Right? So a key scene in the movie's present is when a human soldier cannot bring himself to kill a group of androids, those guys on the right, who think they are family. They think they are family and display all relevant emotions. So we are woefully underprepared philosophically for anticipating super intelligent machines and to think about scenarios like that in at least two ways. To begin with, given that we do not have anything like agreement for how to think about morality, we have no good way of predicting what a super intelligence would do once its own learning kicks in and the issue is no longer about solving a value alignment problem by creating a particular code. Not that these are super intelligence, but even that is kind of too much for this. So there's a lot of disagreement about this. At this stage, it seems appropriate to try to draw lessons from the sheer fact that there is such a diversity of approaches in philosophy and keeps lingering. But with some intellectual modesty, one can really only say we are rather clueless as to how any kind of super intelligence would process morality. Maybe a super intelligence will be super confused from the variations among available approaches. And this has actually also been argued by some people that they said, super intelligence looks at that and says, objectively speaking, this is confusing and just kind of, suspense and collapses maybe. We are also clueless when it comes to assessing what our relationship with machines should be once they assume new levels of sophistication. For in crucial ways, we do not understand ourselves and thus cannot relate appropriately to entities that in significant ways are like us but very different otherwise. They would presumably be like us in terms of intelligence and ability to communicate. They would have different chemical compositions, but beyond that, it is an open question now to what extent such machines would be like us. Crucially, we do not understand the nature of the mind and thus what it takes to have one. And so we do not know what to think of the prospect that machines might have a mind. So, either super intelligences or before, like these guys earlier. But what is nonetheless plausible is that some sophisticated machines must be accorded a moral status of sorts, possibly to the point of even human rights protection. This point gets much initial plausibility from noticing that following James Moore, we can distinguish among kinds of moral status. To begin with, ethical impact agents are agents whose actions have ethical consequences, whether intended or not. Any robot is such an agent if its actions can harm or benefit humans. So it's not something terribly sophisticated. Secondly, implicit ethical agents are agents whose design has ethical considerations built in, such as safety or security features. An example of a security feature is automatic teller machines checking availability or limiting the daily amount that can be withdrawn. So again, something quite primitive. But then explicit ethical agents can secure and process ethical information about a variety of situations, make sensitive determinations about what to do, and even work out reasonable solutions where considerations conflict. Finally, full ethical agents are explicit ethical agents who also have those central metaphysical features we usually attribute to agents like us, such as consciousness, intentionality, or free will. So in the space that opens up here between explicit and full ethical agents, there could be a variety of different types of agency. Androids could display hallmarks of agency, such as interactions with the environment combined with the level of independence and adjustability. We may still not want to say explicit ethical agents falling short of full ethical agency deserve all the considerations full ethical agents deserve, but it would be equally implausible to say they deserve none at all. To get a better sense of what might be in store here, let us explore how one might be able to argue in the first place that humans will remain the sole fully ethical agents. The crucial point would have to be that humans have a mind of sorts that machines cannot have, and that possession of such a mind merits a kind of protection, especially in terms of human rights, we would not have to grant to machines. Humans would be conscious, but machines would not be. But how would that be plausible? Well, the traditional answer is that humans have souls. The general stance is what's called metaphysical substance dualism, a set of views committed to the existence of non-physical mental phenomena. So substance dualism because there's one kind of thing, bodies, and then there's this other kind of thing which is mental stuff. So substance dualism. Not many contemporary philosophers defend such a view because of the difficulties from accommodating mental substances within the worldview the natural sciences offer. Nonetheless, versions of this view do have still defenders, and not merely among the religious. Some distinguished philosophers argue that consciousness is a primitive and basic component of nature. Thomas Nagel, this book here, for one thing, so Thomas Nagel, very distinguished person who got in a lot of trouble by other people in the philosophical community for this book. Thomas Nagel, for one thinks mind cannot arise from physical substances, and so must exist independently in nature in ways we do not yet understand. In attempting to understand consciousness as a biological phenomenon, Nagel insists it is too easy to forget how radical is the difference between the subjective and the objective. But there is no reason to think that if indeed there are two types of substances in the world, machines would be categorically excluded from possessing both of them. How would we be certain that immensely sophisticated machines would not also host souls if souls can be hosted at all? How could we be certain such machines could not host minds if consciousness exists independently in the world? It would be hard to fathom, so maybe we need to have these devices to figure this out, right? But there's no, only because if you're in the religious camp, right? So only because so far the only ways to come by a soul is to have a body. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't even within this mindset, right? So maybe God rewards the creation of something much like us by giving them the soul that He gave us. There's nothing about the religious outlook that would prevent that from being true. It would be hard to fathom why the facts that we are made of carbon and reproduce sexually qualify us for possession of such mental substances in ways entities made from, say, silicon generated in non-sexual ways would not qualify. We have no conclusive reason to think either way at this stage. In addition to substance dualism, there's property dualism, the view that the world is constituted of just one kind of substance, the physical kind, but there exist two distinct kind of properties, physical and mental ones. That's a more common view. Mental properties are neither identical with nor reducible to physical properties, but may be instantiated by the same things that instantiate physical properties. Such views stir a middle ground between substance dualism and physicalism. So physicalism says there's only physical stuff, only what physics talks about is in the world. One version of that is a view called emergentism, which holds that when matter is organized appropriately, the way living human bodies are organized, mental properties emerge in ways not accounted for by physical laws alone. In the contemporary debate, a form of this view has been espoused by David Chalmers, another very eminent contributor to this domain. Mental properties, according to Chalmers, are basic constituents of reality on a par with fundamental physical properties, such as electromagnetic charge. They may interact causally with other properties, but their existence does not depend upon any other properties. Here again, there is reason to think of non-carbon. Here again, there is no reason to think non-carbon material could not be organized in relevantly similar ways and thus give rise to the same properties. So it's actually quite interesting. So there's these guys are both at NYU, so Tom Nagel and David Chalmers, and they both think that in some sense consciousness is out in the world, right? So Nagel thinks it's really kind of independently given as a substance, and we just make this major mistake in our scientific thinking that we are not seeing this. And Chalmers thinks there's no substance out in the world, but there's nonetheless properties that are not reducible, that are constitutive of consciousness, that are also out in the world. And so very much thinking outside of the common view of physicalism, without thereby collapsing into a religious worldview. And so quite fascinating views. So, but according to both versions of dualism, it would simply be an open question whether eventually machines would have minds in whatever sense that would mean for humans. Another way of arguing that plausibly machines will differ from humans, however, comes from the physicalist side. One of the best-known contemporary philosophers who also operates as a public intellectual, Dennett, is thoroughly physicalist in his outlook. Our understanding of ourselves includes not only the body and nervous system, but Dennett argues our consciousness with its elaborate sensory, emotional, and cognitive features, as well as consciousness of other humans and non-human species. But Dennett crucially thinks consciousness is a user illusion, indispensable for our dealings with each other and for managing ourselves. Our conception of conscious creatures with subjective inner lives allows us to predict how those creatures will behave. Human consciousness is to a large extent a product of cultural evolution involving memes, which generates minds different from those of other animals. And so it's quite a fascinating theory. So here's somebody who thinks that humans are completely continuous with other animals, but there's still something enormously different about us. But it's not that we have consciousness and they don't, it's just in addition to the genes that we have evolutionarily, there's also memes, so cultural patterns ranging from anything to sounds that we can articulate to very complicated patterns of behavior that our minds simply keep circulating and connecting to, right? And so that's the Dennett view. But this also means that once we see the full complexity of the brain, we understand it will be hard to create anything close to what it took evolution hundreds of millions of years to generate. Creating general AI, Dennett holds, is possible in principle, right, because it's all physicalist here, but would cost too much and not give us anything we really needed. Instead, we will tend to overestimate, it's actually a very wise point here, instead we will tend to overestimate our abilities to construct such machines, prematurely ceding authority to them. So on both Dennett's view and according to Heidegger, as discussed earlier, it will be tremendously hard to imitate us, but on both views, the complexities involved in imitating us only support the point that something less sophisticated than us must already be accorded some kind of moral status. At least some explicit ethical agents will come up for serious moral consideration, even if they fall short of being the same kind of full ethical agents that we are. We just have to get used to the idea that there's more kinds of creatures that deserve appropriate ethical responses. Yeah. So far we have only discussed views in the philosophy of mind that on the face of it would make it hard to ascribe moral status to machines, and found that none of them give us any reason to conclude machines would never have any kind of moral status. Yeah. So that was the point so far. Right? We have looked at these views that initially seemed to make it difficult to give moral status to machines, and then argued that that's actually not the case, right? That these views still lead us to the view that we have to put up with the fact that machines will have moral status. There are other prominent views that make it actually easier to think machines can have moral status related, if not identical, to that of humans. Among philosophers who believe physics fully describes the universe, the most prominent understanding of the mind is functionalism. This is a theory actually much inspired by computer science. Roughly, the mind relates to the brain like software relates to hardware. Software can run on different types of hardware, and similarly, different types of physical entities can have minds. What matters mostly for us is that functionalism permits mental states to be multiply realized in entities composed of carbon, as well as in others. For physicalists, again, functionalism is the most prominent understanding of the mind. On its terms, the expectation that machines can have moral status is straightforward. The upshot of all this, sorry, this was a detour into philosophy of mind stuff. The upshot is that it is plausible that in the future machines will have moral status of sorts, possibly at the level of human rights protection. On all these views that are prominent in the philosophy of mind, this is plausible. Perhaps we should then have to replace the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Full Ethical Agents. It's a slightly less cool title, but we might have to go there. And Eleanor Roosevelt, I love this photo because Eleanor Roosevelt was the head of the Human Rights Commission that had put this together, right? And she holds this up in this this mixture of pride and consternation, right? And so maybe there's a future to that combination of sentiments. Yeah. If we do that, rebellions of the sort that were the seminal event in extinction might well be avoided. Though humans might fall from the favor of superintelligence in many other ways, but there's no need to provoke disaster. So, conclusion, summing up. Scientific inquiry has moved us to the brink of revolutionizing technology to such an extent that AI is on our radar. But it is also precisely because we have made so much progress in understanding that we also increasingly grasp the limits of our understanding elsewhere. This is the broader understanding of the death of God theme with which we started. Lack of agreement on moral foundations is a case in point. Another is our comprehension of consciousness. Challenges arise for the short, medium, and long term, and it was the latter two that have concerned us here. The medium term is the period when technological innovation will have fully transformed society. The long term is when machines themselves come up for moral consideration. The distinction might be more analytical than chronological again, but is useful nonetheless. Throughout, we drew on insights from Heidegger's phenomenology. First of all, understanding technology is not merely as a set of tools, but shapes the way we live and how we perceive fellow humans and other entities in the world. Secondly, there's much more than intelligence to human life, so that at least it will be much harder to substitute us than it would be if that were merely a matter of building intelligence. But this reassurance also means that moral status might be a much more complex matter in the future than it is now. One major challenge about the medium term is that human rights will be under siege in an era that quite possibly might be shaped by an enormous increase in economic inequality. What is needed is greater focus on distributive justice, both domestically and globally, to make sure societies do not fall apart. And as far as this medium term is concerned, we must also heed the admonition we drew from Heidegger that technology must be used to enhance the distinctively human life rather than impoverishing it. Even more than for the medium term, we are woefully underprepared for the long-term challenges in a way the death of God theme makes clear. We do not have settled views on when artificial minds would be sufficiently similar to human ones to be eligible for the same moral status. But we must be prepared to deal with more types of moral status than we currently do. And quite plausibly, some machines will have some type of moral status which may or may not fall short of the moral status of human beings. This is also a point emerging from the Heidegger discussion. Machines may have to be integrated into human, social, and political lives. We will be better able to do so if we integrate humans more properly in the medium run through greater focus on distributive justice domestically and globally. Thank you.